Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today it is Coach Andrew and I chatting through part three of the photo shoot prep series. And today we're going to be discussing the first half of the photo shoot prep, basically setting up your diet, timelines, expectations, etc. So I'm really excited to get into this one. Basically how we set up fat loss to get things moving along, adjustments along the way, etc. But before we get into this, anything new going on with you this week, Andrea, that you want to fill us in on?
Yeah, last week I had just had like a plateau on the scale for like a week and a half, and that finally dropped down. I don't even necessarily obviously I having a calorie drop, which I did have a calorie drop in my targets this week. That obviously gets things moving, but this was like day two. So like I had one lower calorie day. So I think it was just like my body was due because I couldn't
Okay.
have created I created like what like 80 calories more of a deficit on
Hmm.
that day before seeing that drop, and I dropped by a couple pounds. So
Oh wow, okay.
yeah, and I mean that was after a couple consecutive low days. That's always when I hit a low and then it pops back up the next day after a high day, but on average the trend is looking good this week. I've been doing my fasted cardio. I still don't feel, I tried bumping up my Himbine a couple times to see if I actually felt it, and I don't feel anything. So I think it's just not something that has a huge impact on me. And then I'm supposed to get that fat burner supplement today. So I don't think I'm going to feel anything different necessarily with it, but maybe I will. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, things are
Okay.
trending and moving again, which is nice.
Yeah, that's fat loss for me. A lot of times looks like it'll be like a week, 8, 9 days. Things will stay very, very stable and then a big drop and
Yeah.
then kind of repeat that cycle over. Um, but it is interesting like how slight of an adjustment that was to really see things moving again.
Yeah, mine is always like I'll drop a pound and a half or a pound and a quarter in a week, and then the next week it's like a quarter of a pound, and it
Mhm.
just kind of repeats in that cycle, which is what I'll try and explain to clients too, is like we're looking at a 7 day, Monday to Monday or Wednesday to Wednesday. We're not looking at a rolling average. If we're looking at a rolling average, it would be much more steady a lot of times,
Mhm.
but we're not. So that's why we can't just look at that 1 week because that can get discouraging if you're on those like hold pattern weeks.
Yeah, that's really important to consider always with fat loss. I've had this conversation so many times where a client will see a like 2 pound drop the week before, coincide about things are going, then the next week expect things to not move a whole lot because we just saw, especially if it's like, hey, to start your week, like Monday, we suddenly saw a 2 pound drop from like the previous day down to a new low. And then you just kind of maintain there the whole next week. We'll get a lot of, like things just aren't moving. Do we need to adjust things? Like, nope. Remember, like we just saw this big drop to start this week. I would expect things to stay here. We're going to see another drop shortly. That is really, really important to remember because a lot of times, even like within a week, we have to look at like how are the averages changing across the course of weeks. Even if it was like, that's why the weekly average is so important. Even if again, like let's say Monday, first day of your week, you saw like a 2 pound drop from the previous week, and then you just maintained at that weight, your average weight will probably be like a good like pound and a half at least lower than it was for the previous week. So again, just looking at so much more than just that. Does it seem like I've lost a lot over the course of the last couple of days is important. Okay.
Yeah,
Anything else
and you
on your
can't
end?
get frustrated while you're in that holding pattern and start go off plan. Because if you do that, then you're just never going to see that drop.
Yeah, it doesn't help your cause to, if you're frustrated because you don't feel like you're making progress, not following the plan definitely does not help you make more progress. Anything else on your week?
Nope. What about yours?
Man, my week has been pretty similar to a couple weeks ago I got sick, kind of ended up having to deload. I actually had the same thing happen again. I've had so many clients who've been just like sick the last
Yeah, me too.
like consecutive weeks. And I've kind of had the same where it was like I think I had COVID a couple weeks ago, and then like Katie had a cold, like a cold right after that. Not a huge deal. Like I didn't feel that bad day to day at all, but just enough to where I like got in my training. I was like, man, this feels rough. I just don't have a whole lot in the tank. Well, basically there was like a Friday where I went in and I felt fine going into it. And then like I was like, man, why am I so much weaker? And then after that session was over, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm dead right now. I feel terrible. But that was just like a couple days. So basically we just ended up getting kind of deloading. So not a whole lot on that end for this last week. And then feeling back to normal. So back to pushing hard over the last couple of days. But yeah, that's really where I'm at.
Yeah,
Cool.
everybody in my house is sick right now too. It
Are they?
seems like half of my clients have been sick.
Same. So many
Yeah.
people. 'Tis the season, I guess. All right, you ready to get into the topic here?
Ready?
All right. So again, talking through the first half of photo shoot prep, really how we set up our diet, etc. So to kick things off, fill us in. How do you determine the timeline and the end result the client wants? Basically, when we're mapping out what this process looks like what goes into determining what that should look like?
So if you've worked with a client before and have gone through a fat loss phase, this becomes a lot easier because you can gauge, okay, this is where they got to first fat loss phase. I estimate we need another 5 pounds, 8 pounds, whatever,
Hmm.
to get to the condition that they're wanting. And that's just always helpful because it bases it off of their body. And you also know um how they how consistently they lost before, how aggressive you need to get, and that helps you determine the timeline. But a lot of times this could be somebody who you haven't had a fat loss phase with before. You've gone through a build phase, but you don't necessarily know how things are going to go. And so we can rely on things like maybe their own previous experience on their own, but also things like pictures, goal pictures of kind of the level of leanness that they want to get to. And then us as coaches can take that and go, okay, well, to get to that level of leanness, it looks like you're going to need to lose X number of pounds. And then you can kind of set up the timeline with that. Um, is that kind of how you would adjust that
Yeah, I
too?
think that's a pretty good way to, that's very similar to how I'll approach it. I really like it just in general, like getting, okay, what's the goal physique like? Send me a couple pictures of like what we want to accomplish here, like the look that you would want to bring to this shoot. And then it is really easy to compare and contrast that too. I like that when someone's starting as well, even if we don't like have a photo shoot in mind. So I have a good idea of like, okay, where do we need to build more tissue? Because a lot of times someone's like, oh, I think I need more calves. No one's ever said that to me actually, but um, even where someone thinks they might need to prioritize more, it might not actually be accurate. So I like to really assess that. And then yes, with this, like send me pictures that display about the level of leanness that you want. Cool. And then let's work through based on where you're at. Of course, I can't give you this person's physique, but to get that about that level of body fat, how far do we need to push things? And typically it will be, um, I would say for like a smaller individual, typically here we talked about a lot how like, hey, a lot of women we work with don't need to lose as much weight as they might expect to get their goal physique. That said, in a photo shoot instance, if someone's pushing to get shredded, if we're pushing like below sustainably lean, a lot of times it is like you might actually need to lose more than you would expect. I would say a lot of times, like what someone estimates they need to lose, I would probably add like 5 to 8 more pounds to that for a smaller individual. For like a larger client, like a male client, what someone estimates they need to lose, I would add like typically like maybe another 15, 10 to 15. Like if we're really pushing to get shredded, it typically does require pushing lower than you'd expect. So I like to get a rough, and honestly, some of this is just art of coaching where we've like assessed so many physiques and gone through these phases so much that you can really have a good grasp on how much does a person need to lose to get this physique. Um, but you have a really good grasp on that, and then we can, okay, so I like to kind of put together, I'm guessing to get this to this physique, we need to lose about X amount of pounds. Let's say it is 15 pounds. And then I like to, depending on how responsive the person has been in the past, honestly, if it's someone who's like, I'm hasn't been responsive to fat loss in the past, and I'm not confident we've addressed that, I probably wouldn't be taking them in a photo shoot prep yet. So typically we're gonna know like this person with certainty will be fairly responsive. So I like to set that up as okay, based on that, assuming we could lose about like, let's say roughly like 0.75 pounds or 0.75% of body weight per week, right? So I think that's a pretty reasonable, like someone who's pretty responsive. Um, so again, if it's like let's say you're 100 pounds, that's like 0.7 pounds per week roughly, right? Somewhere around that mark. And then maybe I'm typically going to want to add something like 5 to 6 weeks of extra buffer to that timeline to make sure we have plenty of time. And then, hey, about halfway through this prep, we'll reassess where we're at. We'll actually get the photo shoot date established so that, because again, like I don't like this to be set in stone. I also don't want us to be behind. If we're like halfway through the prep and XYZ happened and we're like not on track for this, we don't want to be scrambling for this in the later half. Like maybe we do need to push this date back further still. That's really how I like to um kind of start establishing what that timeline would look like. And then again, there's typically like halfway through. Let's reassess. Are we on track for this date? Let's actually get the photo shoot booked and go from there. Anything else that you would add on that front?
No, that's pretty much how I would determine the you just have to look at, okay, what's an appropriate rate of loss here, um and then kind of budget that out. And like you said, if you get to the point where things are just not looking like they're going to get to the result that they want, I know that that can be really frustrating or disappointing to have to push that out by a couple of weeks or handful of weeks, but you've spent all this time working so hard toward it, you would just much rather get the result that you want. Like if something happens, you get sick, like majorly sick in the middle of it and have to like lose ground. It's just like you would rather not go into it feeling like you didn't give it your all and get to your potential.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this conversation with one of my clients very recently where we were we were kind of talking through a photo shoot and what that would look like, and she wanted to do it. And it's ultimately about the client, but I felt like in the back of her mind, she like wanted to do more, push for more, but she was a little bit scared too. I was like, hey, if we're gonna do this, like we're gonna do it well. Let's do it all the way. And like let's take it a little bit further than like what you've established here. It's like, okay, yeah, you're right. I'm on board with it. But I don't really know where I was going with that, honestly.
No, that was kind of a tangent. We can move on.
Okay, anyways, how are we determining then from this person? I'm assuming it's probably starting in their maintenance or like slightly over maintenance for a build. So how are you determining how many calories to pull when we start out this process?
So initially you've determined what that rate of loss needs to be. So like that's part of deciding how long this prep needs to be. And so once you determine that rate of loss, then that's going to help you set their initial calorie targets. So a lot of times we want to aim for a quicker rate of loss at first, because we're starting out at the higher body fat that we're going to be throughout this process. And so you're like just motivation is at its highest. You're much more um you're much less risk of losing any muscle whenever you have more body fat. And so we can get things moving a little bit quicker at first. Um but so if you are planning on that, your initial drop is going to be a little bit more aggressive than if you're not. So anyways, if somebody's initial intake, for example, is let's say 2100, then we might have a couple days at 1600, a day at 2000 to 2100, so pretty close to that initial intake, and then repeat that. So they would end up with what, 5 days of the week most of the time at the lower intake, a couple days of the week at that higher intake. Um, Now, those higher days also depend. We might leave those alone or we might pull those down slightly. That's going to depend on if they're starting out from maintenance or if they're starting out in a little bit larger surplus. So essentially, you just kind of want to pull those down initially to a maintenance intake. So from there, you're just assessing their progress. So if you're aiming for a pound down per week and you're at or above a pound per week, then you're going to just keep rolling with that. If they're losing less than a pound per week on average, assuming all the stuff we said at the beginning, like the last week wasn't a huge drop or anything like that, then we would want to reduce calories further, usually by like 100 to 150 per day on average. So you can split that up over those low days and the higher day to create that average on or that deficit on average.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to lay all that out. I agree. Always, almost always, this person is starting from a place where we've been eating more food for a long period of time. Body fat's a little bit higher. So that's, yes, the start of the diet, that like first 4 to 6 weeks, I really like to push a lot harder. And there am really even less than like a poundage number. I'm typically aiming to like, can I really get this person losing right around like 1% of body weight per week? Again, like really want to see them losing a good clip. The first couple weeks, it might be even higher than that still, even can get closer to like 1 to 1.5. Um, Almost like a mini cut the first couple weeks because again, people are really motivated to push during that time. Body fat's the highest, so we're not likely to lose muscle. Training performance, no matter, even if we're pushing harder, like in that state, don't really suffer much. So if we can get as much of the fat loss done as we can during that time where it'll be the least painful, cool. And if we can, then we have more leeway to pull back later on. And I'll say on average, like I think that most people going into a photo shoot prep like this have about 10% of their body weight to lose. I think it's pretty accurate, just a rough number. But I found like through my own experiences and through a lot of clients, unless you're starting at a point where this is going to be a long journey, we have a long ways to go. Typically, we'll be starting in a relatively lean position, and people will kind of be in the like, I'm lifestyle lean-ish. Maybe I'm slightly fluffier than that. Mm, but I would say still like we'd definitely almost always consider someone starting this place already lifestyle lean. Typically, if we're like, hey, I want to get pretty ripped, we're looking at about 10% of your body weight to lose. If we want to like take it extremely far, like if you want to get on stage, it might be a little bit further than that still. But I think again, it typically ends up being around that 10% of body weight to lose. Um, Anyways, again, I don't really have anywhere that I'm going with that past
Mhm.
that.
Well, you
Uh,
were talking about doing the more aggressive fat loss at the beginning. Another benefit of doing it that way is when you start out with, so how I like to do that a lot of times is start out with the first 4, 6, maybe up to 8 weeks being more aggressive, and then take a short diet break for 2 to 4 weeks and then finish out the fat loss phase. Another thing that does is it prevents you from needing another diet break down the road. So one of the questions that we got was, when you've been in a fat loss phase for 14 to 16 weeks and you still have more to lose, would you then recommend a diet break or reverse diet to come back up after a couple months off? And if you have it set up like that, where you're taking that break up front, most of the time that eliminates that need
yeah.
to have to take another diet break at some point later on.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, we can go ahead and answer that now as well. But okay, if you've been in a fat loss phase slash cut for 14 to 16 weeks, but you still have fat to lose, would you recommend a diet break or reverse diet to come back after 1 to 2 months? And you don't have to, like if things are progressing well, if you're adhering to the plan, if you're feeling good. And honestly, like if we're getting pretty lean, you might not be feeling good by this point. Biofeedback will start to suffer. It'll start to get a little bit more rough. Should be hungry. Um, we might not feel great, but if hey, we're still progressing, and especially if there's like, hey, we have to be ready by this timeline. Sometimes we just can't afford that. Ideally, we want to set that up so we have room for this. But I would say on the flip side, if there's like not a pressing, and I don't think this question was necessarily specific to a photo shoot, just in general, like should I take a diet break or not? If there's no timeline and there's not a glaring like reason why we shouldn't, perfectly fine to like take a diet break. I would say though, like if things are going well, we're progressing nicely, and we still want to get leaner. She asked, or should I like reverse diet and come back after 1 to 2 months? There again, unless it's like I'm really just not sticking to the plan. I'm so sick of dieting and I just don't want to do this anymore. Okay, yes, I might take a few months off, maintain, come back to it. But otherwise, I would really probably just take like 1 to 2 week diet break and really try not to kill the momentum that the client already had there if they were making progress prior. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
Okay.
In if this is in relation to a photo shoot prep, a lot of times this is just going to be something that's planned out ahead of time so that it wouldn't get, like, we really wouldn't want to get that far into it because that's pretty probably pretty close to when we would be doing the photo shoot, and then take a diet break and then finish out with like
Yeah.
2 to 3 weeks, you know? So
Yeah.
because it's kind of weird timing, but that's that's kind of why I was talking through, okay, if we had it set up in the beginning, that kind of eliminates the need for that later on, and it's sort of baked into the plan rather than like, oh shoot, I'm this close, but now I'm stalled or I'm not adhering or whatever.
I totally agree with all that. Okay, so from the macro front, what do your adjustments there typically look like?
So protein most of the time is going to stay the same. There might be a case where I pull that down a little bit, just because carbs and fats have now come down so much that we have a lot fewer trace proteins coming in. And maybe like if I started somebody over a gram per pound and now they're significantly over a gram per pound because they've lost that much weight, we can afford to pull that back a little bit, but most cases it's going to stay the same. Fats fats are where I would initially most likely pull down to be more conservative. They ultimately, throughout the fat loss phase, are probably going to come down closer to that 0.3 grams per pound area, maybe a little bit lower towards the end of it when we're really needing to dig. Um, but if we're somewhere around, for most women, to give a very general number, I would say 45 to 50, 55, we can kind of hang out there for a while, and then use that as another lever to pull down later on. But once those fats come down initially to that like 45-ish area, again, just a very general number, carbs are going to make up the rest of that deficit. So it depends on how much you initially need to bring calories down, but I'm not going to be able to do the mental math, but whatever the remainder is after you pull those fats down, those are going to have to come from carbs. Now, on those high days, or if you have it set up as training day rest days, whatever your higher days are, those are going to be for having the additional carbs. So I might actually even go ahead and pull fats down on those days, but leave their maintenance level carbs so that they have those to make sure that their training performance is still in a good spot. And carbs are going to be the thing that has more of a benefit to bump up on those days than anything else.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that. I will say like lately I've been doing more and more like this disparity between carbs on like low days and high days. Like when I'm refeeding, I've tweaked that a bit where I'm more prone to leave fat a little bit higher than I would in the past. And I think that's kind of what you're saying here as well, where like I might dig someone down a lot more consistently, like 30, 25 grams of fat. Um, and just to keep carbs higher. And more lately, I'm biasing. Maybe I'm going to keep this person rather around like, let's say 40 to 50 grams of fat. Still not like an extremely high intake, but rather than like, and this is an example of someone who's like really heavy to dig, but rather than like keeping their carbs at like 125, I might find they actually feel better and respond better with like maybe we're pulling carbs down to like 75. Neither of those intakes are necessarily fun to be on. And then we have those swings to like higher carb days on like our refeed days or high days. I feel like I can't explain the why behind that very well, but have seen people getting a bit better response to that. Um, but I don't think we're off base with like what you're saying there either.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Just like we'll pull fats down to dig, but kind of holding on to some more and using that as another lever to pull later. So it's kind of like it's almost like if we're looking at order of operations with pulling calories down, it's like fats, carbs, fats.
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. Okay. Um, we're talking about things like calorie cycling, carb cycling, kind of relevant to what we're discussing here. How are you typically implementing those, and what different strategies are you using here?
There's a lot of different options that you have here because ultimately we just need to create a calorie deficit. But using these different calorie cycling approaches can help people stay feeling good for longer. And if they feel good for longer, they're going to be training harder for longer. They're going to preserve more muscle. So a lot more recently, I'm using like a 2-1 repeat, two low, one high repeat. And then I'll progress that to 3 low, one high repeat. Um, I like using training day, rest day macros, but a lot of times, like if somebody's training 4 days per week, we just have to get those rest days so low
Yeah.
that it's more efficient if we do the other repeating pattern. So I still do like that, but it really depends on how somebody's responding. So if we can have rest day training day macros and they lose just fine without having to absolutely bottom out their rest day macros, then I'll do that for as long as possible and then kind of transition over to that calorie cycling. Um, for some people, I've also done just like a straight deficit across the week, and then we'll do refeeds as needed. This isn't as often. This is more like for Meredith's photo shoot prep. She just wanted to keep things as simple as possible, just tracking calories and protein. Didn't we tried the training day, rest day macros, and she just didn't like having to have two separate different things of food. And so for her, it was worth it to just have a straight deficit across the week, but I would say that's not as common. Um, unless this is like, okay, we've gotten down the road where we just kind of need all days to be low days at this point, and then we'll give you refeeds whenever you need it to feel good. So it really just depends on where we're at in the process and what we need to do, like what's necessary to keep weight moving down.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like to start lately. Start people two low days, one high day.
Hmm.
Progress that, as you said, to once we need to move things quicker. Would I rather pull those low days lower or go to three low days, one high day? Um, Not a right or wrong there either way. But one of those two progressions, but eventually we'll probably get to like three low days, one high day to keep things moving along. And then, like typically when someone's doing two low days, one high day, they have two refeeds per week, basically. And we're kind of repeating that cycle, of course. Uh, I don't find people normally like in that stage will need more refeeds. But when we go to like three low days, one high day, then based on like reactively based on their biofeedback, I might implement occasionally another refeed. So let's say someone is really struggling with recovering from their training. I sense like, hey, we need a deload here. Biofeedback's really suffering. Okay, I might give you an extra refeed day to help recover from that, right? So those are still like something we can implement as a tool intermittently. We can have this scheduled, okay, we have a refeed like once a week, that high day, and then still like add those in alongside that as needed to again help keep out feedback in a good place, help keep coaxing progress along as quickly as possible. We're going to dig a lot deeper into the more in-depth side of like the stress management, the fatigue management, as we're pushing someone for a more advanced phallus result, which really is a lot more applicable for the latter half of the photo shoot prep, which we will be talking through in the next part of this series next week. So we'll dig into all that a lot more. Again, kind of those fatigue management, stress management tools, because this really is about pushing that stressor of the calorie deficit and the stress of our training, like hitting the person with the right dose for the stress to elicit positive adaptation without it being so much stress that they can't recover from, and then it being actually stalling us or hurting our progress. So we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. Anything else as far as like these carb cycling or different tools we might be using here?
That's really the those are the major ones that I've used.
Okay. Okay. Um, as far as the training side of things go, what does this typically look like? Do you incorporate like does training look much different here versus what it might have looked like before the person started the photo shoot prep?
No, because we're talking about the first half of the diet here. So usually you can, I would say all the time, unless somebody just really has poor habits otherwise, which again, they just wouldn't be prepping for a photo shoot in that case. Um, they're going to be able to still progress just as well on their training, and they're also not going to necessarily need us to pull down their intensity or their volume yet. That usually comes later on in the deficit when it is a little bit harder to recover because calories are lower and they're just quite a bit leaner at that point. Like we talked about those habits, as long as somebody is still maintaining their peri-workout nutrition, they're getting their micronutrients in, they have those foundational habits of hydration, sleep, their recovery should just be fine through this stage of the diet, and their training doesn't really suffer yet.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think the training talk, which again we'll talk about when the next episode is, an actual need to adjust that is a lot more relevant to the latter half. One thing I always like to make sure is in place here is going into this, like if we are starting someone on a new phase of training when they're starting the deficit, We might not have like quite as many intensifiers if it was like, oh, I was really, really pushing them, like we're really, really pushing hard for quad growth before. We're just crushing their quads, right? We might slightly pull that back, but I don't want there to be like a massive change there. Just within what I can gauge they can recover from. But I do want to make sure most of their compound movements we were keeping in place as, again, let's say your hack squat, your leg press, your Smith machine or photo, the split squat, for example. Let's say those were our main like lower body movements for the week. I don't want to swap those out because I want to make sure the person is maintaining or ideally building strength on those movements to ensure that we're maintaining or building muscle tissue. That's really one of our best gauges to make sure that's happening because that's so important for the physique we have at the end of the photo shoot. So I do want to make sure that those are in place. Um, as far as cardio goes, do you typically like to start someone out with the cardio in place, or are we just adding that in as needed? Where are you at there?
I traditionally have saved cardio to down the road when that's like a lever we need to pull to create a bigger deficit. So like we'll start with food and then later on we get to a point where okay, we're starting to have to dig. I'm gonna ask you this question, client. Would you rather add cardio or would you rather pull your food down? In my own deficit, we've started out right away with cardio, so it's making me rethink it a little bit. And with like our work with Dom Kuza mentoring us, that's another thing that he does as well. So it is something that I've played around with a little bit more, adding it in sooner. Sometimes it's just like we're not working with bodybuilders. Everybody has full-time jobs and things like that. So sometimes it is like, hey, I just truly don't have time in the day to add this in. So then we'll just work with steps and food. But it is something that I've started sometimes using a little bit earlier on in the process. I know you have
Yeah.
too, right?
Yeah, I've been just in general in fat loss phases. I am a lot more frequently starting people with like 2, 3 days of cardio. Um, and I find almost always the client can still make it work. And if there's like the occasional person where like, hey, maybe we're just trying to like if you're struggling to be consistent with tracking, which honestly I don't bring on a lot of people who are like in that place. It just doesn't tend to be who we attract. So typically, like in the past, it was like, oh, well, I want to make sure that it's easy for them and they have, but it does help move things along a lot quicker. And people are normally very willing to do it for a quicker result. And it does. It's like it's funny, like with cardio, I feel like it's like there's the message, like cardio doesn't make as much difference as like people think it does, which I think is really true for like there's a lot of people out there who are just like, I'm gonna go run a couple miles and then I don't pay attention to my diet, I don't track my food, etc. Doesn't make it, it's not, we're not gonna get lean if we're not paying attention to those things. Yes. But then I think people almost like turn that around and apply it to like, okay, but if you're dialed in, if we are like tracking all these things, us having you do like 30 to 40 minute cardio sessions a week, I can move the needle along a lot quicker with our fat loss from the get-go versus if we're not. So it's definitely something that I've been using a lot more frequently, like just right out of the gate, just to get things moving quicker.
Mhm. Yeah, either get things moving quicker or allow them to still eat a little bit more, maybe on their training
True.
days, while still
Yeah.
losing just as quickly, which is ultimately just going to help with their training.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So anything else? I mean, again, this next week, kind of laying the foundation for the start of the fat loss phase, which really isn't that different than a lot of other fat loss phase discussions we've had. I think next week is where we really talk about a lot more of the X's and O's of again, like the fatigue management and things like that, the adjustments to training, cardio, et cetera, that go into like, the latter half of the photo shoot prep. And again, like going from lean to shredded, the challenges that come along with that, how to mitigate it. So I'm excited for that conversation. But in this regards to this, anything else you want to chat about before we wrap it up?
No, I don't think so.
Cool. All right. Well, as always, we hope you guys enjoy the show. We appreciate y'all tuning in. If you want to apply for coaching with our team, click the link in the show notes, and we will catch you guys next time.